temple. So when they were still wondering, it didn't make sense to build a physical temple because that kind of means that they're locked in place. At that time, the Israelites were still moving around a lot. They used the tent as the temple instead. So you can see in the center there is this big tent in the middle with that big column of fire. I'll explain that in a second. And the fence that's around it. So that's essentially what the tabernacle is. It's just one tent. It's a unique tent that's always been where the Jews would go to worship God. The big pillar that you see above it is a pillar of fire and smoke that the Hebrew Bible talks about. God kind of would actually literally rest in the temple, in the tabernacle. And whenever it was time to move on, the cloud would lift up and start drifting off, and people would pack up their camp, would pack up the tents, and actually travel with that fire, follow that fire around until it stopped and settled down again, and that's where they would pitch tents again. And so in this way, God kind of led the Israelites through the wilderness for 40 years. You also notice that it's kind of in the center, all these little brown things around it, those little brown mounds around it would basically be Israel tents as well. So generally, they would camp around the tabernacle. The tabernacle served as the center. So not just as the center of the community, but also the center of their worship as well. So for the temple services, you see how there's an outer court on the outside? Within the fenced-off area, there's this courtyard on the outside. And that's where everyone can go in to worship God. Whereas there's the inner tent, we'll talk about the inner tent in a second. In the outer courtyard, this is where they would offer animal sacrifices. And we'll talk a little bit about animal sacrifices in a little bit, but you see that big fire thing, that box of fire coming out of it? That would be where the sacrifices were being held. I'm trying to stretch this out, because again, I originally planned for this to be skipped, all of this to be skipped, but okay. We'll make it work. So it's going to zoom in. It's very exciting virtual tour. It's going to zoom in for us now, and you get to take an inside look into what it's like to worship back in those days. So there we have, behind these colorful cloaks, you see basically there's the altar with the fire, where the priest would slaughter the animal and put the animal upon the flames, and the flames would consume the animal, and that's how they conducted their sacrifices. They'll do the same thing with grain offerings as well, so they do vegetables and livestock. Here we have a basin of water that they use for ceremonially washing their hands after they're done with the sacrifices, before they can go in. So inside, behind this curtain or this veil, is the space that's called the holy place. And if you look inside here, there's a couple of items here. If you look to your right, there should be a table there with 12 loaves of bread. Each of the loaf of bread represents one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay. The table is kind of made out of wood but overlaid with gold. And all the utensils were made of gold as well. If you look to your left, however, you'll see maybe a familiar picture of the lampstand, with the 7 prongs coming out of it, symbolizing the 7 churches in the book of Revelation. The priest's job was to make sure that the oil was always filled and that there was always fresh bread on the table. It symbolizes the light of Christ. And just kind of leading up to it, also there's in the center, the altar of incense, where they burned incense constantly. The incense and the fire never goes out. And so the incense is meant to be there by the doorway because God loved the smell of this incense. And behind this curtain in the back there lies what we call the most holy place. And it is inside there that the Ark of the Covenant resided. The Ark is basically a wooden box that's also covered in gold with a couple of items placed inside. There's the stone tablets from Moses' days. There's a jar of bread and a staff, as we kind of read about earlier on. By the way, the Ark is that thing that Indiana Jones found. So just that help you guys put that in context. There you go. Thank you. Let's head up to the next slide. So that was just a quick virtual tour because I realized the word tabernacle is new to a lot of us, and not all of us kind of understand what it is. So a couple of things just to kind of clarify. So it is a tent. Like it's a tent with a fence around it. It served the function of a temple, essentially. And later on, when the temple was actually built, they modeled it after this tabernacle. In both cases, the temple and the tent, they were unique. There weren't multiple tabernacles, and there was no multiple temples. There was just the one. I need to learn to slow down a little bit because my wife is translating, and she always says I talk too fast. So, very briefly, there's two purposes that I could think of for why we need a temple. The first is it serves as a place to meet God, right? And the second is that it serves as a place to sacrifice. And really, if we can head up the next slide, that first purpose is where I saw the biggest connection to the previous two sermons in this series. In the first sermon, Pastor Joseph talked about the Garden of Eden. And we think about how Eden was created, man, Adam, was kind of put into Eden, and God would literally meet them, like walk among them. Like, if that was a place of meeting, then Eden, the Garden of Eden, can be kind of considered as a proto-temple, right? And then the second sermon, we had the story of Jacob, who fell asleep in the middle of nowhere and had a dream where he saw the heavens open up. There was angels kind of ascending and descending a ladder, and God was standing at the top of that ladder. And he kind of recognized that this is a place where he encountered God in a dream. And so he also kind of called this place Bethel, which meant the house of God. And he erected this stone pillar to kind of signify that this place was somehow sacred. It was a place where he had encountered God. And so in the same way, it also kind of dealt with this idea of the temple as a sacred ground on which humans and God can kind of somehow meet and interact with each other. So those are some of the tie-ins that I noticed with previous sermons. We can head up the next slide though. But the temple also serves the second function of serving as a place of sacrifice, right? And this is really before Genesis 3. So the story of Genesis is really divided into two parts. There's the first part, which is the first two chapters. And at that point, God is creating the universe. The world was good. Everything was great. And then Genesis 3 happened, which is when the whole apple thing went down. They bit into the fruit, and sin came into the world, and all of a sudden sacrifices became necessary. Right? Because sacrifices were a way of compensating for our sins. It's a way of paying for our sins, at least temporarily. And so we have stories like Abraham, who was asked by God to sacrifice his son. We have over here also the story of Jacob, where he erected up the stone at Bethel. He also offered up 10% of everything he owed as sacrifice as well. And there's also the story of Cain and Abel in the top right-hand corner, where they were offering those two siblings, one who wanted to offer his first fruits of his flock, and one who wanted to offer grain from his field. Right? And so this idea of sacrifice crept in also as a secondary function of the temple. Let's skip down to the next slide, please. So at this point, we kind of bring up a question I've often asked in my earlier years, why are sacrifices even necessary, right? And if we read the passage from earlier that Kevin read, the preparations have thus been made. The priests go regularly into the first section performing their ritual duties, but in the second, only the high priest goes, and he but once a year, and not without taking blood. There's the sacrifice, which he offers for himself for the unintentional sins of the people. So sacrifice in the Christian sense and in the Jewish sense has always been tied to the idea of sin. Right? It's always done in payment of sin, meaning that humans did something wrong, and to pay for that somehow there needs to be blood. Which, hit up the next slide for me again, please. It's always kind of struck me as weird, because why do things that way? Why can't God just forgive the sin without the need for a sacrifice? After all, when someone hurts us, in human sense, when us as people, we get hurt by other people, we can choose to just let it go. We can choose to forgive and forget. Why is this so impossible for God? Why is there a need for payment of some sort, right? Does anyone ever kind of wondered that by any chance? Like that's kind of been a question that bothered me a lot for a long time. And there's a couple of ways of kind of going about answering this. One of the ways of answering it is not on the slide, is the idea that God is just, which means that he cannot let things like crimes go unpunished, right? Because if he was to just cancel out the crime, like that would be the nice thing to do, but it wouldn't be the just thing to do, right? And so a judge, just like a judge cannot just ignore the crimes of the criminal and letting him get off scot-free, in the same way, God is in the same position where he cannot just cancel out things that have gone wrong, right? The other thing that I think really makes it difficult for us to understand why sacrifices are necessary is that we have a hard time kind of understanding why sin is such a big deal, right? I mean, to be honest, if we think about sinning, if we think about how, okay, we can understand murder. Murder is like a bad thing, but like telling a lie, just telling a lie, what is so bad about that? Why is that something that requires blood, right? Insulting your mom or cheating on your taxes, whatever your poison. Like these little things we do, like I think we get very good at convincing ourselves that they're not that bad. They're not such a big deal, right? Compared to things like murder, compared to things like adultery, like as long as we're not touching those, we're okay. There's really two ways to measure the seriousness of a crime. The first is by the nature of the crime. So a lie, I think we can all agree, is like less serious than a murder, right? And that's one way we can measure it, is the nature of the crime. The second way we can measure it, though, is by measuring it against like the innocence of the person that the crime was committed against. You notice it's by the dignity of the victim. Right? So let me give you an example. Let's say there is a person who was insulted by somebody. For him to insult that person back, it's kind of understandable, right? We can kind of understand that, right? Does that kind of, you guys understand that, right? So someone like, you insult me, I'm going to insult you right back. That's kind of nuts. That person had it coming. He kind of deserved it in our minds. Now compare that to a mom trying to give her son like advice on life, and the son insults her. It's the same action. You see that? It's the same action. It's an insult for an insult. But the victim deserved it less in one case. Right? And so the magnitude of that crime increased because of who the victim was. Does that, you kind of just get some that, yeah, I get it, Mr. Lin. Like, does that make sense? Tommy, does that make sense? Right? If we kind of compare, yeah, Tommy, here. Did that make sense? Like, if we compare, like, insulting someone who insulted us compared to insulting our mom who's trying to help us, like, that's really bad, even though it's the same thing, even though it's just an insult, right? Now compare that to insulting God, who is infinitely good, better than your mom. Like, I love my mom, but God's bigger than her. God's better than her. Right? Infinitely better than her. Infinitely less deserving of the insult. And you start understanding why even an insult to God becomes such a serious thing. Right. Let me give you guys 3 examples from my life of just sins that I've done. I deliberately picked what we might consider minor things, but just to highlight and give you guys some examples. So I could tell you like some of the worst things I've done, but let's just start with saying, okay, last week, like a person came in to observe my classroom and walked out, and we talked about it afterwards. They say, hey, I really like what you did there. I think that technique really worked really well. It was great. I thought you were fantastic. And I said, yeah, it was. Thank you very much. That was me taking like ownership and pride over my work. It's something I think everybody can relate to, right? And it's actually something that we encourage. Like, we should be proud of the work that we do. So what's the problem there? The problem was that, like, in that moment, I wasn't acknowledging that the skills that God has given me. I wasn't acknowledging the mentorship that God has placed in my life. I was kind of taking all of the credit on myself. And so the work that I was doing wasn't honoring God, it was busy honoring me. And that's a sin. Another example, the same one I gave earlier. Mom trying to give me good advice, and I snapped back at her in a very insulting way. The Bible calls that murder, right? That I could look upon another human being who is made in God's image. Get this, God's image. Like human beings are image bearers of God. They look like how God looks. And we insult that person, right? That's a sin as well. And then lastly, this one's kind of tricky as well. Start thinking like me, starting to think about next week and planning out like, okay, next week, I think Monday I'm going to drive my wife to the airport, I'm going to drive home, I'm going to do some work, the next day I'm going to drive to work. Planning things out ahead of time without thinking about like God and what his plans are and how it fits in with mine. Like just making plans on my own without checking with God first. The Bible calls that sin as well. And so you start getting the idea that like, they don't sound like big deals, but you start comparing them against the God who you're committing these sins against. Like it starts becoming hopefully a little bit more understandable, like why they do matter and why sacrifices are necessary. So the bottom line is this, like sin is serious, not so much always because of like what we do, but it's who we do them against. And who we do them against is God, the infinite and holy one. Okay, next slide. So this brings us kind of to the role of the priest, right? The priest's role back in those days was to offer sacrifices to pay for the crime. So how the system worked was the Israelites know that, okay, you do something naughty, you do something bad, you go to the tabernacle, you bring an animal with you, you bring some offering, you bring some grain, you bring corn, you bring flour, you bring a cow. It depends on how serious the crime is. And also depending on your wealth. So if you're really, really poor and you can't afford a cow, like it's fine. God will take a pigeon as well. The idea is kind of what you're bringing in and like where your heart is at. And so you would go to the priest and you would say, hey, Mr. Priest, I did this bad thing and I want to make an offering to God to cover over my sins. And the priest would say like, okay, let's do this. Go up to the altar, like do the sacrifice, wash off his hands, pray over you, and your sin is covered. Okay, that was the system, that was understood, like that's how it worked, right? On top of that, priests had other, like, so you see kind of like a picture there of like, there was like the sacrifice earlier, there's some ceremonial washing. The priests also kind of took care of the bread plates, they took care of the incense, they took care of the lamp, making sure the lamp never goes out of oil. So they had a lot of jobs. But the most important one always was the sacrifices and making sure that the people of Israel's sins were kind of covered over. Now, there's one problem with this. The big problem with this system was that, like, you go in, you bring this cow, and your sin, like, it's sacrificed, and your sin is covered over. You go home, and guess what happens right away? You sin again, exactly. And so the next day you wake up being like, oh, damn it. And then you like grab the cow and then like another cow, and you kind of, the process repeats itself over and over and over again. It never actually goes away. So the system wasn't perfect. It was kind of awkward. It's an extremely awkward system where God only really interacted with his people through his priests at this location in the tabernacle and only through this blood and gory sacrifice system. That's all very, very, very weird, like to us, because we live in modern time and we don't do the whole animal sacrifice thing anymore, right? Now here's the thing. I understand the whole tent thing in the desert and the whole animal sacrifice thing. It seems like something from a different time. And when we come to those things in the Bible, it becomes a little challenging to read through, and we start thinking, oh, that's just them back then. It has nothing really to do with us. But then here's the thing. God governs kind of history. right? You guys, we know that. God controls history and is progressively revealing himself to the world by the way that he guides that history from one period to the next. So that, yeah, the old periods will have a couple of customs and rituals that are kind of unique to that period, but it's not worthless because it reveals something about himself and what he's doing in redemption history. Let me put it differently. The animal sacrifices matter because God designed it. Right? He was the one that said, here's how you're going to do the sacrifices, here's how you're going to build the tent, here's how you're going to build the altar. God was the one that kind of put all of these things in motion. Right? And if we take a look at that passage that Kevin read earlier, part of it said this: according to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper. So it's already acknowledging this doesn't work. This ain't working. We got to keep killing animals over and over and over again. But deal only with food and drink and various washings and regulations for the body, imposed until the time of the Reformation. Do you guys know what the word imposed means? It's a bother. It's bothersome. It's mafan, if I dig into my Chinese. It's a hassle. The Bible was saying that this was a hassle. Never mind us. We're thinking, oh my gosh, every time you do something wrong, you have to bring a cat. The Bible acknowledges that this is a hassle, that this is a cumbersome system. And yet God was the one that designed it in the first place. And so we need to kind of ask ourselves, instead of saying, that's just weird, that's not worry about. The fact that God designed it and it's scripture means that we need to think a little bit about, well, why? What's the purpose behind it? It's a couple of possible purposes. I think, so a couple of, a couple of the weirdnesses, just to recap. There was the unending sacrifices and the weird, pointless seeming rituals, the clothes that you would wear and all these weird rituals that happen. The fact that only a couple of people gets to meet God, and the fact that God encounters only happens in a little tent. That's so cumbersome. So why? Why design the system this way? So head up to the next slide, I think. No, not quite. Never mind. I didn't put it on there. So there's a couple of possible reasons why. I think one of the reasons is to highlight the fact that God is very distant, very separate, very strange and different from us. That differentness needed to be highlighted. Okay. The word for holy in the Old Testament, kodesh, instead of meaning holy, it actually means separate, separateness, apart, to be not together. That's what the word holy meant. And the whole curtain, the veil, the physical barrier, the curtain that blocks one section of the tent from another, so that God's presence dwells in the inner part, and then you can only come to the outer part. That all is partly intentional to kind of highlight this difference between God and humans. Right? It also teaches us that we're not able to meet God's standards. The fact that God gives us the laws for telling us what to do, and we keep breaking them over and over and over and over again. Right? And to show that, even when given a sacrificial path to God, so you can kill an animal if you screw up, kill an animal, we'll be okay again. The fact that you have to keep doing that over and over again shows us that we can't sacrifice enough to cover over our sins. So all of this serves to highlight this difference between us and God. And if we weren't aware of that distance between us and God, we wouldn't be able to get to him. So Jesus wouldn't make sense. We wouldn't see a need for Jesus in the first place. Which brings us to the next point. Now it's the next slide. So now's the time of Reformation. It's already happened. But when Christ appeared as the high priest of the good things to come, he entered once for all into the holy places. Remember, the high priest could go into that inner chamber once a year, but he has to keep going back every single year. Jesus enters in once. That was it. It's done. Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things to come. He entered for once into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. So I kind of like, I'm a science teacher, so there's a data table over there for you guys. Christ's blood greater than animal blood. The fact that Christ's blood is permanent, it had to happen once, compared to animal blood, which was temporary. The next time you sin, you have to do it again. And the fact that Christ's blood cleanses not just our bodies, but our souls as well, which is why we only need to do it one time. Like, all of this serves to show that Christ's sacrifice was permanent and beautiful. Okay, next slide. So, which brings us kind of to the final place. The tabernacle is a place for meeting God. It was also a place of sacrifices as well. Right? And for a period in history, that's how they did it. They killed animals in order to appease God through sacrifices, and so they could keep coming back and meeting God in that place. And then Jesus came along and changed everything. His death, once and for all, paid for all of that, so that there was no more need for sacrifices. And that meant a couple of things. At his death, some of you guys might know this story, but at his death on the cross, the veil, that curtain in the temple that separated the inner chamber from the outer chamber, that veil got torn apart, like miraculously. And so what was hidden, what was once hidden away on the inside, what was once sacred place, the most holy place that people can't get to, is now right there, right in front of us. Right? And so there is no longer a need for priests to ask God for forgiveness on our behalf. Right? There is no longer a need for like us to find God in this one little like tent area or in this like back corner of the temple. God is everywhere now. Right? And so we, at this side of the cross, experiencing unprecedented access to God, where we no longer need to kind of go through sacrifices, because the sacrifice has already been made. The price has already been paid. Like that sin that's eternally damning has already been paid for. And God, who once was kind of like hid himself in this little back corner, is now like, he's everywhere. And he says always been everywhere, but now that veil is gone, like it's become that much more clear. Which brings us to kind of the difficulty or the struggle that we face. It's a lot easier when we have easy access to things to take things for granted. Do you guys know what I mean? Like if you love coffee and you suddenly get a coffee maker in your classroom, you have easy access to coffee. It's a lot easier to just take coffee for granted until the coffee maker breaks. Then you start appreciating coffee a whole lot more again. Right? In the same way, like I think our access to God makes us underappreciate his presence. I think our access to God makes us underappreciate like our ability to just ask for forgiveness, and so we forget to do so. Right? And there's something beautiful about the fact that they used to have to struggle for all of that, but now that we don't. My final closing thought, I guess, is wanting to point out that the tabernacle that used to be the center of their worship, of Christian worship, the fact that it's not there anymore is it's a double-edged sword. It's wonderful, but at the same time, like it leads us to a place where we need to constantly remind ourselves of the fact that God is everywhere does not mean we can ignore him. Right? And the fact that we can approach him anytime does not mean that we can put off the approaching efforts on our part. I'm not making sense. I'm going to close off in prayer. Thank you, God. Lord, I'm not sure how that went. But Lord, I just trust, Lord, that these words are yours. They're definitely not my own. We just ask, Lord, that it takes root over time. God, we thank you for your desire to dwell among us, God. From the Garden of Eden up to the tabernacle, into the temple and into our present times, and into the future, Lord. God, I'm just excited, Lord, that there is no more temple at this point on this side of the cross. Lord, that your blood has paid for it all. So, Lord, thank you, God. And would you just remind us of that fresh every single day? Would you remind us that your mercy is new every morning?